Okay. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really honored to be joined by Professor Yezid Sayigh. I'm going to read a short biography, which outlines just some of his experience and career. Professor Yezid Sayigh is a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he works on the comparative political and economic roles of Arab armed forces, the impact of war on states and societies, post-conflict politics, and authoritarian resurgence. Previously, Professor Sayigh held teaching and research positions at King's College London, the University of Cambridge, and the University of Oxford. He was an advisor and negotiator in the Palestinian delegation to the peace talks with Israel and headed the Palestinian delegation to the multilateral peace talks on arms control and regional security in 1991 to 1994, and headed policy planning for the permanent status peace talks and technical consultancy on Palestinian reform between 1998 and 2006. He's authored a comprehensive and really extraordinary history Armed Struggle in the Search for a State, the Palestinian National Movement, 1949 to 1993, which was published in 1997, and later wrote We Serve the People, Hamas Policing in Gaza in 2011, and Policing the People, Building the State, Authoritarian Transformation in the West Bank and Gaza, also published in 2011. So our conversation today will draw on his landmark book, but also center on the contemporary situation to ground it a little bit historically in a longue durée. I'm going to start with a personal question. Could you tell me a little bit about your personal background and how you came to be a historian of the Palestinian National Movement? Oh, and I'm going to unmute you because I realized I didn't give you that prerogative.
That would help. Thanks. Yeah, no, well, it's a special privilege, I think, to be with you today and to be invited by Namod to discuss this. And I know everything that's going on in Israel and in Gaza means a tremendous lot to everyone here today. To answer your question, I grew up in Lebanon to parents who came from Palestine, from North Palestine, who fled from Tiberias in 1948, I believe in April, and fled to Lebanon. The family house is still there to complete the personal note for anyone who has been to Tiberias. It's now the Habayit Chinese restaurant next to the Lido, which now has a sort of new extension. I think it's called Pagoda over out on the water. I actually visited there once and was let in by the Arab kitchen worker, which was nice. This is a bit of the background. Of course, I grew up, luckily, well, not in a refugee camp. My family were educated, so I grew up in Beirut, managed to go to a good private high school and then to university. And of course, Palestine was all around us in every possible way, and not just by being Palestinians, but I mean, almost every Lebanese person I knew or any other person I knew lived there in the 60s or early 70s, was caught up in what had happened to the Palestinian people in terms of the Nakba, the mass exodus, exile, and of course then the liberation war and the continuing conflict with Israel. So I was both, an activist involved in various domains, also a student activist and unionist and so on. But in terms of my personal career development and sort of intellectual development, one influence clearly was my parents, who were very deeply committed to universalist, humanist, liberal ideals. And so I picked up my basic values there. But I had a personal interest, obviously, in conflict and war in the military domain, and that became the basis which eventually emerged into the expertise that pulled me into the peace talks my development from the late 70s during the 1980s as a strategic analyst, and eventually as someone who's competent to engage directly in negotiations as part of the Palestinian delegation with the Israeli delegation in the early and mid 1990s and onwards. So I don't know if that goes far enough to answer your question. There's probably a lot more I could say, but I mean, I guess I'd like to say that I've always had cause to reflect on my sort of the duality or multiplicity of my sort of daily life and identity, being Palestinian, Lebanese, but not really Lebanese, you know, sort of citizen of the world, but also going from the academic to the practitioner worlds and trying to bring all these things together in both an ethical and intellectual framework. And I guess I'm saying this because this is the sort of the roots of what we'll be discussing next.
So, yeah, thanks a lot. I'm going to touch on your book. In writing it, why is it that for you, the armed struggle was the key framework through which to understand transformations in the Palestinian National Movement between the 1940s and the 1990s?
Well, the first motivation was I wanted to write a military history. As I said earlier, I grew up with war all around, and so I was exposed to a lot of the sort of literature that certainly men tended in my generation to get exposed to, you know, all these sort of different weapons, MiG-23s and 21s and Mirage jets and so on. And so this was a very sort of narrow, sort of rather masculine type of interest at first. And I wanted to write a military history of the kind that I used to read about the Napoleonic Wars or World War II. And I wanted to write something that put the Palestinian liberation movement in that framework. Now, and I conducted a lot of research, archival research, but also conducted hundreds of interviews with members of the PLO over a period of about a decade or so, or a decade or more. And the important thing really I wanted to get to is that in the course of this, I found that my questions about how many guns or battalions they had or whatever were actually entirely the wrong questions. This wasn't what was important. What was important was precisely your question to me: why the armed struggle? Why? What place did it occupy in people's personal evolution and in the politics of the Palestinian movement? And so from here, I moved away from my interest, my previous interest, or my initial interest in sort of the guns and the tanks and all that, to asking questions about why, if the armed struggle was so seen as so important, was presented as so important, as so foundational, why was it so poorly conducted? Why was it such a failure most of the time? Why? How to explain that? Why was it still seen as so central? And I think, well, in a bit of a big nutshell, there were three things I came away with. That armed struggle, first of all, was a way of reasserting and pulling together a national identity. You know, Palestinian society in 1948 was totally decimated. Something like 2/3 of the entire population were uprooted from their homes and ended up somewhere else, either in other parts of what used to be British Mandate Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem as we know them, but also elsewhere, especially in Lebanon, Syria, and of course, mainly in Jordan. So these were very scattered places of exile. And in each place, Palestinians came under very different administrative, legal, and security rulers who, you know, in some cases offered much more in the way of civil rights and even of nationality. In others, where they were denied these entirely, as in Lebanon. And so that ultimately the re-emergence of a new generation of young Palestinians who emerged in the 1950s and 1960s were shaped by very different kinds of contexts, different sort of cultures, even different business cultures for those who got into, you know, business, say in the Gulf, someone working in the Gulf or working in Jordan, working in Egypt under socialist policies of the 60s, or working in Lebanon, had very different attitudes to gender relations, to social relations, and so on. And yet, out of this came a more or less unified liberation movement, what we know as the Palestine Liberation Organization, that was formed in the mid-1960s. And armed struggle played a big role, firstly, in reasserting the idea of the Palestinians who would go from being refugees waiting on handouts and charity from the international community to people who took their own fate into their own hands, and the gun was the means to that, and that new dignity. And this was very strong in the early literature of these Palestinian movements, starting with the Fatah movement that Yasser Arafat eventually led. So there's that. Then there's the second element, which was that the Palestinians had never governed themselves. Either they were under the Ottoman Empire, and then under the British colonial rule, and then under Egyptian military administration in Gaza, or Jordanian administration in the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem, or else, as I mentioned earlier, under the rulers of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and so on. And so to speak for themselves, to represent themselves, was almost impossible. And I think it's very interesting, certainly for me, that the first sort of in a way, the nucleus of a new Palestinian national movement actually started out in unions. The student union, especially, almost all the later PLO leadership started out in the Palestine Student Union of the 1950s, Women's Union, Engineering Union, Artists Union, Workers Union, Farmers Union. There were all these unions that managed to sort of operate under the radar vis-a-vis these Arab governments, and were allowed to recruit and mobilize within, their sort of union areas of activity, all of which were inevitably highly political and highly patriotic. So out of this came the first institutions, but then there was a push to acquire more of a formal institutional nature. And this was the Palestine Liberation Organization, which the Arab governments were never really happy about. They didn't really want this autonomous Palestinian actor wandering around. The Jordanians didn't want it because they claimed the right to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and they didn't want a rival claimant. The Egyptians didn't want anyone who had autonomy in the Gaza Strip and who could drag them into a war with Israel that they weren't ready for, at least at the time. So this was always a huge dilemma, and it generated a deep feeling among many Palestinians, especially Yasser Arafat and that generation, of the feeling that they had to, at almost any price, be independent of what they called Arab tutelage. They needed to be genuinely independent. And so state building, what I call state building, the attempt to turn the PLO from, let's say, a guerrilla movement into a state-like actor that earned or won the official recognition of other states. And in the international relations literature, for those who studied IR, recognition is seen as fundamental to the existence of states. That unless other states recognize you, you don't exist as a state in a way. So the late 1960s saw the emergence of the Fidaiyin movement, the guerrilla groups, and because the 1967 war with Israel had destroyed the Jordanian army, the Syrian army, these governments were no longer able to control their own borders or their own populations or the Palestinian refugee populations. And the PLO was able to wrest control over the refugee camps and indeed to gain the support of tens and hundreds of thousands of Jordanians and Syrians and Lebanese to their cause. So there was this sort of twin process of acquiring some kind of territorial base outside historic Palestine, but also of forcing themselves on Arab governments first and foremost, who eventually recognized the PLO officially as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And this became the springboard for the PLO to go to the United Nations, to gain observer status at the United Nations from the mid-1970s, to become a full member of the non-aligned movement of 77 members or countries of the Global South, to join the Socialist International, and so on. So this was a key outcome of the armed struggle. And finally, and this, I think, also takes us to the present day and 7th of October, is that waging war, waging the armed struggle became a means of competition between different Palestinian factions, that whoever could show more, more martyrs for the cause could claim more popular support, could claim a bigger share of seats on the PLO parliament in exile, a bigger share of resources from the Palestine National Fund. So there was this kind of dynamic in which the armed struggle went from simply being about nation building and national identity, but also became a means of political competition. And then I'll come back to this later, but I mentioned 7th of October, and in a certain manner of speaking, what we've seen since at least the year 2000, with the start of the Second Intifada and until last October, is that Hamas, in a way, played that game. That is, through their suicide bombings inside Israel, and then their rocket attacks, increasingly sophisticated, and right up to the 7th of October, to some extent, part of what they were doing was competing with the previously dominant nationalist movement, Fatah, of Yasser Arafat and the PLO, to say, we are the true resistance, we are the people who truly represent Palestinian interests and represent Palestine. And to, I don't want to sort of exclude other aspects to this, nor diminish other dimensions or other causes that Hamas was pursuing on the 7th of October. But I simply want to underline that to some extent, this is a continuation of a dynamic that started in the 1960s.
Thanks. That's really interesting also, what you touched on, the kind of search for recognition being quite integral, exactly because of that statist ambition or state-like dynamics that were driving, being intimately tied to the need for recognition. So historically, Palestinian nationalism, as you've said, was shaped in relation to conditions of exile and dispersal, and the pressures and postures of the host Arab states, as well as once prominent ideologies like Pan-Arabism and socialism. It has over time also evolved in relation to Islamism and to an entrenchment of the material realities of belligerent occupation, apartheid, and siege. How do you understand Palestinian nationalism today? And you also drew a small distinction in your when you were speaking between patriotism and nationalism, which is something you also kind of the evolution from patriotism to nationalism, but you can take it as you want. But I'm pivoting a little bit to the more contemporary reflection.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I sort of checked myself when I used the word patriotism, just because I didn't want to sort of confuse things. And I won't go down that particular avenue, although it's an interesting one, what we mean by patriotism versus nationalism and so on. But I simply meant that, people fighting for something they believe, whether it's their country, the homeland, their community, their people. I meant patriotism in that sort of basic sense of, defending your neighborhood. But to go to your question, so I mean, it was inevitable, of course, for Palestinians to be influenced by the same kinds of things that were influencing other Arabs in the 1950s and in the 1960s and beyond, and indeed other people around the decolonizing global South, the Third World. I mean, think back a little bit to the 1960s when the PLO was established and the Fatah movement launched its armed struggle. This followed just 3 years after Algerian independence, after a brutal war of liberation from France. It followed the Cuban Revolution. It followed, of course, the escalation of yet another Vietnam War, this time between the Vietnamese and the United States. And it was also accompanied in the mid-1960s by the Cultural Revolution in China. So the rise of national liberation movements in Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia. So, and of course, eventually the rise also of the African National Congress in South Africa. So this was an era of finishing the business of decolonization, the rise of liberation movements and of social liberation movements, of liberation theology in the Catholic Church. I mean, everything was happening in the 1960s, and of course, 1968 in France and in Germany and elsewhere. So for one thing, what the Palestinians came up with was partly a natural response, to pick up the gun and fight for their homes. But how they did this and the sort of ideological framing had a lot to do with what was happening around them, and was very similar to what other people, Syrians or Egyptians or Iraqis and Algerians, were also the kinds of ideologies they were adopting. Socialism or some form of socialism was what every other Arab government played with or experimented with in the 1960s in the economic domain, for instance. So whether it was Arab nationalism of the Ba'athist kind that became dominant in Syria and Iraq, or Nasserism of Egypt, or monarchism, people who wanted to unite with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and then, of course, various strains of Islamism, especially in the 1950s, the Islamic Liberation Party, who still exist today, although they're sort of unrelated in a meaningful sense to what was initially based in Jordan in the 1950s. So these were all natural evolutions. And I guess it's also natural that in every society there are people who veer to the left, others to the right, secular right, or to the religious right, whether it's, Catholic or evangelical, Protestant, or in today's Israel, Jewish. And of course, Islamism has always been there. Having said that, it is very striking that in the 1960s and early 1970s, Islamism was almost non-existent in the PLO. There were various reasons for this, but the main thing is that the dominant groups, once the dominant groups had emerged and taken over the PLO and sort of shared out their share within the PLO's structures, like the parliament and like funds and so on, they tended to block new factions from coming in, or they tried to buy them out, in effect, splinter groups and so on. The people who didn't want to become part of this were the Islamists. And as I think we all know by now, this has been extensively researched, so I don't feel I need to prove it. The attitude of successive Israeli governments during the 1970s and 1980s to the Islamic movement, especially in the Gaza Strip, but not only, was one of tacit, and not simply tacit tolerance, but actually a sort of a tacit encouragement. They were allowed to fundraise and to build their institutions and so on. The perception being that these would be a counterweight to the supposedly secular PLO. And so the Islamists bided their time, they grew, they proselytized, they focused on cultural, social issues, education, and so on, which is very typical of the Muslim Brotherhood in wherever it exists in Arab countries. It's always been mainly, primarily focused on the social domain before moving to the political. And so the Palestinian Islamists, especially those leaning towards the Muslim Brotherhood, followed suit. And this was a natural thing. It happened in every Arab society. Of course, we fast forward to 1987, the first Intifada, almost overwhelmingly peaceful, or at least, let's say, non-armed. And that is when the Islamist movement decided to shift from being sort of in the margins and having this sort of coexistence with the Israeli occupation to moving into open opposition to the occupation and laying claim, trying to stake its own claim to a share of the PLO, a share of recognition among Palestinians. And this was something that triggered a struggle that we're still living today. And again, to some extent, the 7th of October can be interpreted, at least, as an attempt to deal a coup de grace, a mortal blow to what is left of the legitimacy and status of the Fatah movement in the West Bank in particular. So this has been an ongoing, pretty bitter divide since 1987. The Islamists set out to distinguish themselves by calling strike days on different days than the rest of the nationalist forces had called for. They wanted to mark themselves apart and to demonstrate that they were something different and better. And this is, to my mind, one of two very deep, long-standing divisions within the Palestinian National Movement. I'm going to come back to this again later. Sort of those who are, say, more pragmatic, who went for a two-state solution through negotiation with Israel, versus those who might not necessarily be opposed to negotiation, but who believe in a one-state solution of one kind or another. So these I'm trying to sort of start, planting the seed here that there have been very long-running and very deep and often bitter and sometimes even bloody political debates and divisions within the Palestinian National Movement from very early on that accompanied the period before the Oslo Accords, after the Oslo Accords, from the Second Intifada in 2000, and that I think we're, in a way, seeing the last sort of the last act in that long drawn-out play. I know from here we can really start branching out into sort of understanding Palestinian politics and the evolution, especially since the Oslo Accords, which I think was a critical moment for the Palestinian National Movement. And I think we're coming to the end of that entire era. But I guess I'll just wrap up by saying that I hope, let's say, we'll come back maybe in discussion with your audience about how to understand this ideological dimension. I mean, Palestinian Islamism is, I think, like Islamism in most other societies. It's partly about conservatism, social conservatism, and religious belief and faith, which, I'll be clear, it doesn't have to be a bad or negative thing, but it tends to be those things, whether we're talking about Indonesia or Texas, and whatever religion we're talking about. But what's important here, and I think this is a distinction that people have to start making properly, is there's a huge difference between people who are devout or believe in religion, but then how that is instrumentalized politically. And so Palestinian Islamism, in a way, was simply another form of Palestinian nationalism, but with an Islamic guise. Not to say it wasn't sincere, but that Islam was, in a way, an ideological tool to an end, just as a previous generation of Palestinians, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Palestinian Communist Party and so on, adopted Marxism, not insincerely maybe, but nonetheless, it was ultimately also a tool, an instrument or a means towards Palestinian national aims. So that's not to say they're all the same. They aren't at all. And I think there are key differences between Islamism and, say, Marxism. But just to point out that whether this is Islam with a Palestinian face or Palestinianism with an Islamic face is something one has to think about.
So we've already touched, I guess, on a lot of my next question, which was, to what extent do you see Hamas's tactics, strategies, and ambitions as a rupture or continuation with earlier political actors? But I wanted to just pick up on your initial reaction in October, which was that you said that what they had done had threatened 50 to 60 years of what Palestinians had fought for in terms of recognition of their cause and international support. And I just wanted to see, I mean, how do you see the political ramifications of that from today's vantage point, given everything that has unfolded since then?
Right. Well, here we're really at sort of the absolute crux of everything, and the bit I want to most get my teeth into. So I'm going to start with the second part of this, I mean, the rupture aspect, by arguing that I don't see this as a rupture, in the sense, at least, that, to my mind, what Hamas did on the 7th of October, in fact, what it's done since the year 2000 at least, through its deployment of suicide bombings in 2001, 2, and beyond, until 2005 and the unilateral Israeli withdrawal from Gaza under Ariel Sharon. And then its shift from there to trying to build a military force that was more professional, more organized, more sort of conventional inside the Gaza Strip, and from which it then resorted to focus on rocket fire rather than on suicide bombings inside Israel for a variety of reasons. So in all of this, my first, the first strand in my argument is that although Hamas tried to portray itself as offering a model of armed resistance that was different than what had gone before, I feel that there was nothing in what it did that actually was not a repetition of what the PLO factions had done in the previous 30 or 40 years. I'll clarify that. the idea of the armed struggle in the 1960s was sort of all-embracing. People looked to China or Cuba, Algeria, as I mentioned before. They saw total liberation, people's war, guerrilla war expanding to people's war. There were all these sort of, exciting things going on in the air there at that time. But defeat in the civil war in Jordan and the exile from there to Lebanon and coming under huge pressure from the Syrian regime of Hafez al-Assad was a very sobering experience. And it resulted in the dominant Palestinian leadership, Yasser Arafat and his colleagues, coming to the conclusion that armed struggle wasn't this thing that was going to liberate all of Palestine. At best, it was a tool for leverage, for pressure, that would help secure them a seat at the negotiating table. And that's why from 1973 already, the PLO started to shift its official political program towards what ultimately became formal acceptance of a two-state solution. Now, I'm emphasizing this to say that from 1973 or 74 onwards, and that's partly what I document in my book, from there on, violence, when used by the PLO, was always towards a particular political goal at that moment, like saying, you're discussing having a peace conference, but we've not been invited. You can't ignore us. We're going to remind you that we're here and fire some rockets or do something else. So ultimately, the maintenance of an army in Lebanon and various forms of organized violence were always geared towards a political message of some kind or another. They were a negotiating tactic. They were a bargaining card. Now, Hamas sort of in a way has tried to play it both ways, that they represented something where by not recognizing Israel, refusing to recognize its right to exist, and by talking about the whole of Palestine, they could continue to appeal to a certain audience and their own constituency and appear to be, purist in their ideology, while at the same time, the actual military methods they used and the armed power that they developed was never going to do more than deliver political messages and gain a seat at the negotiating table. I mean, that is the irony, that the most they ever arrived at, including the 7th of October, was never going to go more than help them negotiate something, whether that was the lifting of the siege, whether that was liberating Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, or whatever. And so in this sense, it's central in my thinking that what Hamas did was not a rupture, but a continuation of the same paradigm. They didn't break the old PLO paradigm. They just continued playing it. And in that sense, I think that the 7th of October, the horrific war it's unleashed, and the destruction of a lot of Hamas's capacity and manpower and so on, whatever the outcome of the war in, hopefully in the near future, but whenever that happens, it's my sense that Hamas, in effect, played the final act in the play, as it were, of that whole era of Palestinian national politics that's reemerged in the 1960s, that took shape, institutional form, in the form of the Palestine Liberation Organization, that wrapped itself around the notion of armed struggle, but under the PLO, armed struggle and negotiation. And Hamas, I think, has taken that whole line to its final point. So it's sort of the last organization standing, because the other Palestinian nationalist factions, Fatah and the others, have become decrepit, discredited, illegitimate. They have no vital force in them left. They've come up with no solutions in the last 20 years to the reality of ever-encroaching Israeli occupation and settlement activity, or to questions of sovereignty and of sovereign access to the outside world and so on. So Hamas was sort of the last organization standing, and it's in a way self-destructed. And with that, I think the whole era that was started in the 1960s of the PLO is now at an end. What comes next is going to take years to take shape, I think. Now, I'm sort of sticking the end of all this right here, sort of 2/3 of the way in, because then I want to come back to the first part of your question, which is why I said that on the 7th of October. I mean, I think I said this on the next day, once the scale and nature of the slaughter of non-combatants of civilians in southern Israel became apparent. That is when I understood, just what had happened in its sort of fuller scope, and I could see what that would do in terms of the course of events. And I don't just mean the Israeli counteroffensive, but I also mean in terms of, as I said, everything the Palestinians had fought for in the previous 50 or 60 years. Some people fought for a lot more, but the net result was to acquire institutional status and autonomy as represented or as demonstrated or embodied in the recognition of the PLO and of the Palestinian cause and the right to national self-determination by most countries around the world, and some form of institutional autonomy inside what used to be historic Palestine, specifically in the form of the Palestinian Authority and the various organizations that operate today in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in Gaza. A lot of blood was lost and shed to arrive at those gains, which in my view were often less than they could and should have been, and usually at a price that was higher than needed to have been paid. Nonetheless, these were gains that were real. But what Hamas did on the 7th of October, regardless of any other aspects that one could bring in, or but just on this point, that they made it so much easier. The slaughter made it so much easier for all the elements, what gains had been made in the way of recognizing the Palestinians as a national people, of having certain basic rights enshrined in various UN documents, even the right to resist, which is also enshrined in a UN document, and so on. All this has been put in question. And for proof of that, we have the United States government, the UK government, the French government, the German government, many other governments, especially in the West, if not uniquely in the West, or almost uniquely in the West, refusing to engage or activate international law to contain and limit the Israeli military action in Gaza. That is something that in 1982, when the Israeli army besieged Beirut, that was different. When Israeli forces allowed right-wing Christian Lebanese militiamen into the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, where they committed a horrendous massacre, and where the Israeli defense minister, Ariel Sharon, was convicted by his own country's commission of inquiry as being at least indirectly responsible and was forced to leave office. We're light years away from, in Israel, where 250,000 Israelis marched in the streets in 1982 in horror at the massacre. And where, even Ronald Reagan called what the Israeli army was doing in Beirut a Holocaust. I mean, it's astonishing to use the word, but he first used it. And to demand of then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin that he stop the massacre instantly. Think of that, and think of what happened after 7th of October. So there were consequences, and I think there's a huge problem among Palestinians and their supporters in recognizing what happened and acknowledging it, if only because the costs are so very obvious. So I want to add one final element here, which I haven't touched on so far, except maybe just indirectly when I mentioned Ronald Reagan and the international environment in 1982, or even after 1993 and the Oslo Accords and the hope of peace, when the international community engaged directly and put a lot of effort, political and financial and so on, into helping to make the peace work inside Israel and Palestine. The world has changed since 2000. We, across the world, around the world, we see the rise of nativist, ethno-tribal, sectarian, right-wing movements and governments which are racist or ethno-nationalist in an ugly way. We've got, Hindutva, Hindu nationalism of Modi's India, which is working actively to disenfranchise its 200 million Muslim citizens, all the way through to, Proud Boy and white supremacist militias in the United States, through neo-Nazis in East Germany, or the rise of parties in France and Italy, both of which have their roots directly in the fascist parties of the last century. This is the world we live in right now. And we also live in a moment where liberal politicians, as we see amazing, very graphically in Germany, for instance, adopt the hugely essential fight against anti-Semitism, but they perform it and parade it in a way to obscure the fact that they're not standing up to the far right on its racism, on its Islamophobia, on its anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Arab, anti-foreigner racism. And we see this sort of duality. I'm not talking about double standards. I'm talking about an abdication by liberal parties like the Labour Party today in the United Kingdom, or the Greens in Germany and many others, who are failing to hold up their core liberal values at home, and therefore are abdicating the arena to the ideology and the right-wing discourse of the far right. And this, I think, is hugely scary. It threatens us all. But for me, this is hugely important when we discuss 7th of October, because unfortunately, what Hamas did, whether it intended to or not, I don't want to get into that debate, but what Hamas fighters did on the 7th of October has basically enabled the most right-wing responses across the West in particular to everything, where there's a fundamental disregard both of international humanitarian law that these Western parties and governments and liberals are meant to be defending. And it's like they are now actively taking this apart and undermining it themselves at a moment when we've got, rising nationalism in China vis-a-vis Taiwan. We've got someone like Vladimir Putin, who is uniting the European far right deliberately. At this moment, liberals in Western governments have failed. So I'm simply trying to say that for Palestinians who maybe felt that, or I think more than maybe, clearly felt on the 7th of October, they felt a euphoria and celebrated, because for them, decades of humiliation were being avenged. And finally, the Israeli army was being proven to have failed. They could see that and they responded emotionally to that. But what is tragic is that unlike 20 or 30 years ago, when there was still something you might call a Palestinian national leadership that could think politically, that could think about the international scene, where the world was, what was going on in the world, that is now absent. And so I think that a lot of Palestinians and many of their supporters, especially in younger generations, may be very idealistic. They may be people who haven't got a racist bone in their body or an anti-Semitic bone in their body. But for them, there is no leadership that sets a course politically or ethically. And so for them, basically, anything that is an act of resistance, an act of defiance must be celebrated and embraced. And I personally want to try and push for a more critical thinking on their part, as well as, of course, on the part of the kinds of Western liberals I was criticizing a moment ago. So it's just to remember to see the 7th of October in its moment in world history. We're in a world history where things are going to very dark places. We all need to fight to push back. That means a lot of alliances, a lot of unity among us, a lot of solidarity, a lot of coalition building across all sorts of lines. And we have to have at least some core values that we share, because this is where I see the world going. And sadly, we may find that in 6 months or 12 months' time, I mean, imagine if Donald Trump is back in the presidency in the USA and making buddies with Viktor Orban in Hungary, best buddies with Benjamin Netanyahu, best buddies with Modi in India. These are the kinds of people our world is going to be shaped by within months, and who are already obviously a huge influence. So for me, again and again and again, 7th of October came at a moment when the world was heading somewhere. And it's sort of like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. It wasn't why World War I happened. World War I happened because of 20 or 30 years of the scramble between European powers for colonies, for trade zones, and so on. But the assassination was that moment that, tipped things over. And in a way, 7th of October was that for the Palestinians for sure, but I think for more than just them.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there is a related question that comes from that for me around autonomy and the extent to which that, even since Menachem Begin sort of set that in, kind of fostered that in the late 70s, how much the frustration with that, with the failures to proceed beyond autonomy has been a factor in some of what's unfolded more recently. But I just wanted to pick up back on a question, because I think we won't have a chance to delve back historically, just to unpack a little bit the other aspect, which is very important in your book and that you've alluded to a little bit already, which are these kind of status dynamics, or the overall argument you make that the Palestinian National Movement has kind of continually been involved in a process of state building since 1948, and most especially since the early days of the PLO. I just wanted to touch on it because it might seem like a surprising argument to people, given that the PLO has always lacked sovereign authority over a distinct territory throughout its history. I mean, even with this autonomy, it has never been sovereignty. So yeah, how is it? I mean, what is the significance of that argument, and why you draw it in your book?
Well, it came out of my research and came out of several iterations of me refining my thinking and discovering the sort of literature about nationalism and state building in other parts of the world that allowed me to situate the Palestinian experience in other frameworks, and to start answering my questions that I laid out at the very beginning, which was, why was the armed struggle so central? And if it was so central, why was it such a failure? And that, until I understood that it was serving other purposes, that it did other things. Now, I want to give an answer that's not too academic here, but part of the answer is academic in the sense that you for a long time, at least, you'd find, certainly back in the 1980s and maybe a little bit beyond that, in academic disciplines like political science or sociology and so on, there was always a tendency that whenever it came to the Palestinians, people took the position that, well, you can't apply this particular disciplinary approach to them because they're stateless. They don't have a state, so we can't think of them in terms of state building or state dynamics or other related, processes, that they're somehow sort of almost out of history. And partly what I was trying to do ultimately was to write them back into history by writing a narrative, in this case, wrapped around the military dimension and what ultimately became not about the military dimension at all, but, my book about the armed struggle. And I finally found that the idea that just because they're stateless didn't mean that they didn't undergo processes that independent sovereign states underwent in similar ways in the same period. So, and that's why the acquisition by the early guerrilla movements of the 1960s, when they took over the Palestine Liberation Organization, they acquired an institutional structure that already had recognition from the other Arab governments. So this gave the Palestinians something unique right at the start, or very early on anyway, which was that they already had an institutional structure that was recognized by states as being sort of like a state. And they very consciously provided it with institutional structures, bodies that were similar to what states have. So it had the equivalent of a Ministry of Finance, it had the equivalent of a national army, it had a political leadership, it had a parliament. So there were these dimensions that made it look like a state. And this was very strong in Palestinian thinking at the time, which is partly a reflection of how powerful the idea of the nation state is in our world and has been for the last century, that this is how people organize and this is how national self-determination takes form. It's also interesting that within the Palestinian movement, one of the deep divisions was actually between those Palestinians who said that by joining the PLO and sort of occupying this bureaucratic structure, they would be corrupted, would become, pragmatic and become non-revolutionary, non-authentic. And there was a very deep division between those who wanted to maintain a sort of revolutionary, authentic ethos of national liberation and total liberation and combat and confrontation and struggle, versus those who thought very pragmatically that we need, in order to survive and to get anywhere, we need to use this institutional vehicle and turn it into something. And of course, that did lead them towards compromises that they had to make in order to pursue that path. And that was the path of the PLO under Yasser Arafat. So, I mean, it's interesting that, of course, some Palestinians never really bought into that whole logic, just as various academics, in the West at least, thought, well, the Palestinians, they don't have a state, so they, we can't look at them within that analytical framework. But the PLO did behave like a state. It behaved like other Arab states. So control came from the top down. It wasn't really democratically based, although it wasn't authoritarian in the manner when we think about Syria or Iraq or Egypt. It was very different. It was much more pluralist, much more participatory, and even democratic in many places, certainly in the occupied territories, as we saw in the first Intifada. But there was a tendency to build from the top down and to control. And I think that was partly what went wrong after the Oslo Accords, is that Yasser Arafat, instead of trying to prepare his people for the final stage of negotiation with Israel over the two-state solution and, to haggle and negotiate over borders and to confront the settlement activity that continued throughout the Oslo years, instead of preparing people and mobilizing people for peaceful, nonviolent confrontation of these things, which I think was necessary and legitimate, Arafat was busily trying to recreate control by putting people on the payroll, expanding the police force, and basically creating yet another Arab state. So ultimately, the Palestinians, this sort of state in exile or state in formation, whatever you want to call it, looked all too, unfortunately, like most other Arab states, which was logical. They were all formed in the same era, influenced by the same idea, the Western nation-state model. And even in the 1990s, when the World Bank and the IMF and others came into Palestine to monitor the international aid and assistance going to the Palestinian Authority, at that time in the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority actually had a more sophisticated institutional apparatus performing far better than quite a number of independent sovereign states in the Arab region, let alone in the rest of the third world. I mean, they were actually outperforming many sovereign states that that sit in the UN. So there's a huge irony that if we look at, the sort of classic state indicators of performance and governance and transparency and, whatever, information sharing and recruitment and so on, the PA in the 1990s was actually doing pretty well. So to my mind, the using statist framework was helpful partly to bring the Palestinians back into history and to say, no, we can mainstream how we think about Palestinian dynamics and understand these dynamics the way we understand the rise of any nationalist ideology or any sociological process, or the emergence of a political economy in the era of neoliberal economics. All these things are possible. Rather than sort of exoticize the Palestinians and see them as somehow standing outside of all of this and being some crazy case.
And how do you see the dynamics of statist ambition playing out today in Palestinian politics, given the erosion of the viability of the two-state solution with all this unabated settlement expansion? This arc of embracing historical compromise and the historical forces within the movement that did kind of veer towards that under Arafat. Today, we have a very different reality on the ground. And so is that ambition still animating part of the movement? Have other forces become ascendant?
Well, we're sort of jumping to what would have been my final remarks, and that's not a bad thing, maybe. Not that I need to end, just that I think make sure that I get these ideas out before too late. the sad truth is, there is no viable state option at the moment, and not because the PA is corrupt or incompetent or whatever. There are other reasons, but there are no viable political actors. I mean, this is what I was saying earlier, is that Hamas, whether we like it or dislike it, was the last sort of seriously organized political force. It's in a way committed suicide. And I say that not because they triggered a war that's destroying them, so much as that the 7th of October, in a certain manner of speaking, I felt at the time, I mean, early on and then back in October, was a sort of coup d'etat by the militant wing inside Gaza against the political leadership who by then were pretty much all in exile. So already Hamas had come to a moment of truth between the faction that had pushed for moderation and by 2017 had moderated its own charter to open the way for a two-state solution, even if they didn't want to call it that, versus the more militant members of the military, the Azzuddin Qassam brigades, Hamad Deif, but also his political counterparts inside Gaza. And these are people who, obviously went through all sorts of formative experiences in prison in Israel, having their, limbs lost or family killed in Israeli assassination attempts and so on. With all of that, these were, to my mind, they are not a political leadership. I mean, they don't have that awareness of international politics and of the bigger picture that you need at that level. And they were clearly competent at putting together a military plan and executing it. But they, I think, fell far short of understanding the scale of what they were doing, the impact of what they were doing, the timing of what they were doing, and so on. And that it makes a huge difference between killing a soldier and killing an unarmed person, even a soldier who's non-combatant. And it's not good enough to say, well, they're all settlers. These distinctions, which say Hezbollah in Lebanon knows how to make, seem to have been lost on this particular group in Hamas in October. And why I'm going to that is that Hamas has fundamentally, well, damaged itself, possibly destroyed itself, probably written itself out of the script for many governments around the world, at least certainly for the United States, for Israel and others. How they get back into a political process of any kind is very difficult to see. And that assumes that they can survive in the form we know or that they know. I think we've moved, and there's not a rupture, it's the end of an era, as I was arguing earlier. I think we've moved into a new era in which the Palestinians do not have viable political organizations. And I think that's terrible. I know that the Israeli far right is no doubt, delighted at this kind of thing, not because I'm informing them of something they don't know, but they've seen this, for at least the last 20 years. They've been going somewhere they've been planning for, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think the Palestinians face years of drift, as they did after 1948, when their society was broken up. Their sources of livelihood and of social standing and status and dignity were lost. I mean, for an agrarian society in 1948 to lose land meant they were nothing, and they were looked down upon by fellow Arabs, fellow Palestinians, as people who were without honor. But also what happened in 1948, and this is something I'd meant to say when I first mentioned this, I'll throw it in now because it's pertinent, that centers of urban life that were emerging in Palestine at the time, Jaffa, Haifa in particular, and to a smaller extent, other smaller cities. This was where the new middle class was forming, the educated, Western educated middle class, the professional class, people whose social status and whose livelihoods did not come from being part of the old aristocratic families or landowning families. So this process of modernization was aborted in 1948 because these were the cities that were lost and became part of the new state of Israel. And most of this middle class was broken up and scattered to the Gulf and to Lebanon, Syria, America, elsewhere. And today, in a way, we've got something somewhat similar, which is that the entirety of Palestinian society that is under Israeli control, whether in East Jerusalem, one form of control, citizens of Israel, another form of control, West Bank, Area C, Area B, Area A, differing autonomy, right, of Palestinian autonomy, and then Gaza, what was until October and what will be in the future. You've got nearly 7 million Palestinians of different kinds of formal status or formal nationality who are dismembered and disconnected totally, physically, geographically, but they don't even share one marketplace, let alone an economy. They don't control the factors of production, water, natural resources, the electromagnetic sphere, in other words, radio, television, whatever, access to the world. They are totally fragmented and broken up in a way we haven't seen since 1948. And so to expect a new kind of politics to emerge once more, it's going to take a long, long time. And it was easier in a way in 1948 because there was a lot of sympathy in Arab host communities, Arab host populations, a lot of people who were resented their own governments and their role in the tragedy, etc. Now, where I want to end on that, wrap up that point, is that I actually formed an opinion on the second day of the second Intifada. This was, I think, something like, well, the second day that the guns came out, I think something like the 2nd of October, 2000, that the window for a two-state solution had closed. I came to that conclusion then, and I wrote about it over the next year. And the year after the reoccupation of the West Bank by the Israeli army, I also wrote an article, this is in the journal Survival, that the Israeli settler community, the far right, could feel that its historic victory was finally there, because the various legal, political, institutional, and other barriers to the settlement enterprise had all disappeared, whether through the Oslo Accords or through the failure of the PLO to develop and mobilize to resist, and through the resort to guns in the Second Intifada, which I regarded as a huge historic mistake. And so over in that period, from the start of the Second Intifada and by 2002, with the reoccupation of the West Bank, I felt both that the two-state solution had ended and was just not going to come back anymore for various political reasons and dynamics in both societies. The world was shifting. We could see it. 9/11 happened, and again we were in a polarized world, the war and terror, and so on. But then also that the Israeli far right was growing for its own sociological, demographic reasons inside Israeli politics. The rightward shift was a long-term trend, and one that also was happening in every society around the world. Why shouldn't it happen in Israel too? But it happened in Israel in a particular context of what has now come by many people to be called apartheid, or at least, let's say, different legal regimes applying to different demographic communities living in the same territory, whether that is, Israel proper or in various occupied territories. And of course, the settlement enterprise, which is a sort of late 19th century, early 20th century form of organic nationalism playing out in the 21st century. So I felt already over 20 years ago that this part of Israeli politics could claim historic victory. They could smell it at least. And so I'm just trying to say that I don't look at 7th of October and its aftermath in the context of just the last 5 or 6 months, or even the last 5 or 6 years. We came to the crossroads 24 years ago. We all did. Israeli political leaders and Palestinian political leaders all came to that crossroads. They all made bad choices at the time. And from then on, we've been on a downward path. So I'm sort of surprised by one thing, is that at that time, I thought that the Palestinians, it would take them 10 or 15 more years to develop a new national agenda to replace the old one, whatever that was. I'm not someone who's opposed to the two-state solution. I'm still not. I still think it had a chance in the 1990s, but I knew that after 2000 it wasn't going to happen. It turns out that my expectation of another 10 or 15 years to wait for a new agenda to emerge that Palestinians would wrap around as they did in the 1970s or 60s, I was hopelessly optimistic. I mean, this is 24 years later, and I'm now thinking about 30 years away from now. So what happens over the next 20 or 30 years, sadly, is not going to be about some kind of orderly political process. There are no political actors, Palestinian political actors, who are able to confront the challenge, not because there aren't loads of hugely energetic, powerful, committed people and highly capable people, but it's not up to them alone. It's up to what is happening inside Israel itself, and it's up to what's happening in the world. And I feel like we're, the Titanic in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with, an ocean swell that's 5 miles deep and 500 miles wide, and we're just bobbing about on the surface. And again, I think we should all fight for today a ceasefire in Gaza. We should fight for, some kind of revival of mutual recognition between people, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Arabs, and so on, as humans. And that's going to take forever to do again. And we outside have the luxury, the privilege of not being under the bombs and not being faced with checkpoints and so on and guns. And we have to fight where we are in the UK and Germany and France, maybe elsewhere, to preserve, academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of protest and assembly. We actually have to fight for these here in the West. And that is part of the fight for, peace and justice in Palestine and Israel. And we're going to have to do that for the next 20, 30 years if we're ever going to get somewhere. It's not like we say, oh, well, it's not going to happen for 30 years. We're just going to sit back and, let events take their course. We'd better start fighting for all this. You are fighting for this. And, I'm so impressed and admire what Nahmod is doing and stands for. And I think, we need many such initiatives and efforts. So I sound scared, if you like, terrified. I am. But I also feel, we have to fight. So there's a lot of fight in me left.
Well, I had 2 more questions before I open to the floor, and I'm not sure whether we want to either touch. Well, I mean, it brings to mind some of what you've said. Really, the last question I had, which was about the current moment being widely recognized as a second Nakba in the kind of scale of atrocity and destruction of Gaza. And I mean, you've touched a little bit. I wanted to ask what kind of relations and resonances you notice as a historian, and also what kind of impact you've mentioned the impact of 48 on the Palestinian movement, the dispersal, and how it took until the kind of late 60s until things took form. So if you feel you've touched on this already, we can move on, but it's just in terms of how this is even being historicized in real time, given the scale of forced displacement, and this kind of incredible trauma and ongoing loss, and just utter devastation also of the cultural sphere, and history and identity.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, you've laid out the reason why people are comparing with the Nakba of 1948. And the easy part is to think about it in terms of the destruction, the physical destruction, the dislocation, and the dismembering, if you like, along with the threat of mass expulsion outside of the borders of what was originally British Mandate Palestine. I'll just call it that. And clearly, the threat is real because there are far-right elements who are no longer the fringe in Israel. They sit in government, but they also, sit there in opinion polls and in the electorate. And I understand increasingly in the army. I mean, we're still used to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, as being led at least by people who are sort of come from, I don't know what to call it, the secular establishment or whatever. But my understanding is that a growing number of battalion commanders and maybe brigade commanders come from the kind of demographic that is part of, both the settler movement and the far right, whether it's religious or not. And so we're used to, I think I personally at least, and others I believe, found comfort in the idea that there was an adult in the room, which was at the end of the day the Israeli Army Command, and I wonder how much longer that's going to last. Now that's sort of, I'm taking myself out of my depth a little bit to come back to Palestine and the Nakba. We've heard many calls for mass expulsion. There are liberals in the West who sort of say, but wouldn't it be kinder for the people of Gaza to go somewhere else like Egypt or Uganda or wherever? And they think that they're being kind and humanitarian rather than just playing into a far-right nationalist agenda. And I think that the people of Gaza should have the absolute right and entitlement to leave if they want and to go wherever they want. Absolutely. I wouldn't want them to stay stuck there as hostages to a national cause. But equally, I think that people who try and evade their responsibility to lobby their own governments to come up with genuine responses to the human catastrophe that's happening in Gaza, I think, people who find that a mass transfer would be somehow kinder are people who are at best lazy and who aren't taking on their responsibility as individuals within their communities or political parties or trade unions or whatever to push for something that's more of an answer than that. So there is a threat, although I don't think it's imminent, partly because the Egyptians don't want to, the Jordanians are scared stiff of a mass expulsion, and I think this will not easily happen. And it won't happen on the scale of 1948. The borders are no longer porous. The population numbers today, I mean, Gaza alone has, something like 3 times the number of people who fled from Palestine in 1948. So, the logistics of this, people talk about mass exodus and mass expulsion, thinking that it's easy to put 10,000 people on buses, let alone 100,000 or 2 million. And I don't want to turn this into some crude number thing. I'm trying to say that it behooves people who want to fight for Palestine to look at these things really carefully, because they need to understand what they need to fight, where to fight it, how to fight it. So back to the Nakba. I think where what's sort of most distressing in a way, and I said this just a few minutes back, is that it's this total dismemberment of the body politic of Palestinian politics, the decline over the last 20 plus years of the old nationalist movements of all kinds, and the final destruction of the one other movement that was nationalist but Islamic, which is Hamas and its partners. That is happening, and we're back to a situation we saw in 1948, where there was no more Palestinian national leadership. The national leadership of the day, Hajj Amin Husseini, the Higher Arab Committee, and others, not just the Hajj, because he tends to be, a notorious bête noire for people in Israel or in the Zionist movement. But there were many others, and they were in prison or exiled or discredited as a class. I mean, after 1948, ordinary Palestinians regarded them all as having failed and being responsible for the Nakba. Today, we're in a sort of similar situation where no Palestinian movement has genuine faith and trust. Hamas may have that in public opinion polls. I don't think that has much meaning if Hamas is unable now or in the foreseeable future to operate politically among Palestinians and recruit and present a political program that has any hope of going somewhere in the real world. So again, that's where 1948 is. 1948 is where, for the last 30 years since the Oslo Accords, Israel maintained its control system. This is something that, as a negotiator, during the Madrid peace process and in Washington, D.C., and then after Oslo in the negotiations, and then in my role as basically head of policy planning from 1999 onwards for a few years, preparing for the so-called final status negotiations, it was clear that what the Israeli government had done from 93 onwards was to reinvent and reproduce its entire control system but from being directly in your face with the military government, they dissolved the military government, but created civilian committees based in Israeli ministries inside Israel that effectively undertook an extraterritorial extension of Israeli law and civilian systems into the occupied territories with Palestinian agreement and cooperation. To cut a long story short, the Israeli control system treated, especially after 2000 and the reoccupation of 2002, stopped treating the Palestinian territory of parts of East Jerusalem, of the West Bank and of Gaza Strip as one territorial unit, one institutional unit, one economic and social demographic unit, and instead has been dealing ever since with the city of Nablus and the city of Hebron and the city of Bethlehem or the city of Ramallah and Gaza Strip and so on, separately from each other. A business person in Hebron today needing to do business, to import or export goods, for instance, doesn't really go through the Palestinian government, but actually picks up the phone and calls the Israeli liaison officer for his town or city and gets the permits he or she needs. And then, so basically everything about the Israeli control system has been about reproducing the old fragmentation of Palestinian territory and society into different bits and pieces, so that ultimately all this, weakened once more Palestinian politics and the national movement. It enabled Israeli control on a very pervasive scale. And this, by the way, if you go back to the early books by people like Sabri Jirius or Fawzi Asmar, or later on David Kretzmer and others, even, I forget his name, Landau, I think Jacob Landau, a rather conventional sort of Zionist type sociologist. And nonetheless, all of these people described how between 1948 and 1966, when martial law was lifted over Arab communities inside Israel itself in the 60s, within the 1967 borders, everything in the control system was about working clans off against each other and villages off against each other, provoking land disputes, giving some people money and making other people envious. This entire system is, has been recreated in the West Bank since 2002 in various ways, with the intermediary role of the Palestinian Authority. And now what the Netanyahu plan for Gaza is basically to recreate clans and so-called community leaders to help re-educate Palestinians, help do governance, while the Israeli army undertakes security. This looks to me like everything from 1949 to 66 inside Israel, from 67 to 93 inside the West Bank, and from 2002 onwards in the West Bank. It's yet again a recreation of a control system that is all intrusive, all pervasive.
The last question I had, and then we have to think. But we're already running at an hour 25, and I just want to take
I think we should really wrap up.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because you've mentioned, your time as a participant in the Oslo process. How do you think your perspective on that period diverges from popular understandings of it?
I had hoped not to end on Oslo because it's such a divisive.
So maybe let's
No,
not.
no. Well, no. Hang on. I mean, because I sort of wanted to not end up on a divisive issue, at least divisive among Palestinians, or at least my opinion might be unpopular. But I think the Oslo Accords, for all their faults, and I was very aware of the faults at the time. I was involved in the process. I wrote my critique. I shared it, and I had huge worries about it. But it did one hugely important thing. It shifted the confrontation between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization to the political domain. It asserted negotiation as a foremost means of engagement, but more important than negotiation, because it's not purely about being pacifist or whatever, it created political recognition by both sides, and it gave the Palestinian Liberation Organization an institutional base in its own land not in Arab exile, and in direct contact with its own people. And it could proselytize, it could recruit, it could unionize, it could build institutions, it could deliver services directly to its own people in a way that it had never been able to do in exile. This, to my mind, was a huge, enormous historic gain, both in terms of the institutional autonomy and the gains of being within your own social fabric, but also in terms of the unique opportunity to have a different kind of engagement with Israelis, all Israelis, to travel freely into any part of Israel, go to schools and universities, to other fora, and to talk directly to Israelis, to be on Israeli media, TV, radios, as many Palestinians were. To my mind, this was fundamental. I grew up in a day where we thought in terms of political awareness and what we called political struggle. That meant actually engaging and debating with and confronting and opposing and changing or being changed by other people's political views. That is the core of everything. Because if you don't change the politics, you don't change reality. If you don't change people's beliefs and perceptions and what they, will put their hand in yours for, then you've done nothing. And Oslo, to my mind, created an opportunity for that, which was wasted by both sides for various reasons. And we're running out of time, so I'll use the last 2 minutes to say that for me, Oslo did offer a very real opportunity. We could all have done more with it. I think the opportunity was there. There were imbalances, there were structural imbalances, as people like Yezid Sayigh argued, but that wasn't all of the story. That was part of the story. And that's something that needed confrontation. And I use the word confrontation because I thought and believed that every time the Israeli government authorized groundbreaking on a new settlement like Har Homa, south of Jerusalem, for instance, near Bethlehem, all the Palestinian leadership was able to mobilize was the late Faisal Husseini, Salah Ta'mari, the Committee for the Defense of Lands, put up 2 or 3 or a couple of dozen tents for a couple of weeks, and that was it. Why was the Palestinian leadership not mobilizing tens of thousands of Palestinians, unarmed Palestinians, to swarm the whole hill and physically block the bulldozers? That was the kind of confrontation the Palestinians should have been engaging in every day. Every day there was a settlement activity. To say, no, this is the land that we're negotiating over, you're not going to change it. And I think then there was a partner inside Israel that would have accepted the legitimacy and the logic of that. So I'm not saying no to political struggle, no to confrontation. I'm just saying there was an opportunity for that kind of confrontation and to build a real ally inside Israel, which already was there. There was a peace camp and it had substance. It might have been Zionist or Zionist liberal or all these various labels, but it was there and was real. And I want maybe to end on this by saying that a huge challenge for Palestinians back then, today, and in 30 years is whether it's a 2-state solution, a 1-state solution, whatever the solution is in this land, that solution doesn't have to make sense only to Palestinians who think, wow, but this is great, it's humanist, it's secular, it's equal rights for everyone. That's beautiful. But you need a majority of Jewish Israelis to feel the same way. And until we get to the point where they too see a common platform, then we don't have a solution. We don't have an outcome. It's not enough for Palestinians to do the right thing or feel good about it or propose solutions that are visionary. These visions have to be a shared vision. And that is a struggle. And that's what I mean by political struggle. And unfortunately, so many lost opportunities later, with the world going where it is, where we're all ethno-tribal, we see our hurt and our victims and our victimhood, and we refuse to see it for the other side. With that, we're just back in sort of World War I or World War II. That's the kind of polarization we're up against. And somehow the rest of us have to hold on to something and keep pushing back and looking for ways where we do share a platform. Right now, I think it's in these fundamental, non-racist, anti-racist, ethical values that are, that confront anti-Semitism, all other forms of racism jointly. This has to be a partnership.